Hello, my name is Alexey Kravchenko. I'm from Trade Policy and Facilitation section of UN ESCAP office in Bangkok. Welcome everyone to this virtual seminar titled Accelerating Climate Smart Trade and Investment for Sustainable Development, Global Launch of Asia-Pacific Trade and Investment Report 2021. We will begin with opening remarks by ESCAP Executive Secretary and Under-Secretary General of the UN, Ms. Armida Salaya Al-Sihabana.
Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the launch of the Asia-Pacific Trade and Investment Report 2021 on accelerating climate-smart trade and investment for sustainable development. I would like to thank the Government of New Zealand for its sponsorship of this event. I would also like to thank the World Trade Organization for kindly agreeing to be our physical and virtual host, as well as our co-organizers and co-authors of the report, UNEP and UNTAD. We all know that international trade and investment have lifted billions of people out of poverty in the Asia-Pacific region alone. This economic growth, however, came at a steep environmental cost. Climate change, caused in large part by greenhouse gas emission from human activities, has become the main offender of natural disasters in the Asia-Pacific region today, and they are set to become more frequent and more severe. The latest report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change provides indisputable scientific evidence in this regard. The Asia-Pacific region is not on track to meet any of the Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, Goal 13 on climate action has actually regressed since 2020. As such, it is high time to make international trade and investment climate smart. As explained in this timely report, the links between trade, investment, and climate change are complex. The key is to ensure that the positive effects of trade and investment are maximized, such as by promoting trade and investment in renewable energy and low-carbon technologies, while minimizing the adverse effects by digitalizing trade and transport system. Putting a price on carbon and eliminating fossil fuel subsidies remain fundamental elements on which urgent progress needs to be made if trade and investment are to become more sustainable. The Asia-Pacific region has become the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and the report finds much room for all economies to make trade and investment more climate smart. As key trade partners seriously consider putting border taxes in place on carbon to address carbon leakages and loss of competitiveness induced by domestic carbon pricing policies, economies in the region that are not taking steps towards reducing emissions risks are being pushed out of key markets. The rollout of COVID-19 recovery packages may provide opportunities to invest in low-carbon technologies and sectors, opportunities that should not be missed considering the urgency for action. While implementing climate-smart policies comes at a significant cost, particularly for carbon-intensive sectors and economies, the cost of inaction is far greater. Strengthen multilateral and regional cooperation, proactive domestic regulatory reform, as well as effective private sector engagement will be essential to ensuring that the economic transformation needed to mitigate the climate crisis takes place, and that those most affected are not left behind. I thank you for your attention and trust you will have a very fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ivo Armida. Next, we have a joint message from His Excellency Mr. Damien O'Connor, New Zealand's Minister for Trade and Export Growth, and His Excellency Mr. James Shaw, New Zealand's Minister of Climate Change.
Fossil fuel subsidies distort markets by artificially lowering the price to produce, buy and use fossil fuels. This not only harms the environment, it's a barrier to the uptake of clean and more efficient technologies.
For our planet to thrive and for future generations to inherit from us communities that are livable, we need to address the climate crisis. If we are to have any chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, we must cut global emissions in half by 2030. That's only 9 years away. And right now, one of the most substantial roadblocks in the way of cutting emissions is fossil fuel subsidies.
Subsidies are a trade issue. Trade rules can be a vehicle for driving action on climate change. The COVID-19 economic recovery must support a low emissions and climate resilient future.
Right now, there are some countries spending more on fossil fuel subsidies than they are on their health and education systems. We simply cannot allow that to continue.
The case for using trade rules to address fossil fuel subsidies is compelling, and some countries, including New Zealand, are already showing the way forward. New Zealand is seeking to renew a fossil fuel subsidy reform statement at the World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference later this year, and we will be encouraging other countries to join us. We're also working hard as chair of APEC this year to progress fossil fuel subsidy reform.
Our intention is to increase transparency of existing subsidies and build knowledge and capacity by sharing experiences of subsidy reform.
Now is the time for us to work together to develop trade rules on fossil fuel subsidies.
Thank you very much. And now a special message from His Excellency Mr. Tipu Munshi, Member of Parliament, Honorable Minister of Ministry of Commerce of the Government of the People's Republic of Bangladesh.
Excellency Ms. Armida Salcia, Executive Secretary of ESCAP, His Excellency Mr. Damien O'Connor, Minister for Trade and Export Growth of New Zealand, His Excellency Mr. James Shaw, New Zealand's Minister of Climate Change, distinguished colleagues of New Zealand Government, ESCAP, UNIA, and UNCTAD, ladies and gentlemen, very good morning, afternoon, and evening to you all. I feel greatly honored to speak a few words at the global launch of Asia Pacific Trade and Investment Report 2021. The subject of this year's report is perfectly pertinent in the context of existential crisis the global is facing due to the warning cost of emotion and greenhouse gas. Industrialization, trade and cross-border transportation of commodities has resulted in polluting the sea and river and overall the environment. Humanity has excluded itself from the flora and fauna, causing a self-isolation for himself. Dear colleagues, the adverse effects of such isolation we experienced and have been experiencing during the pandemic. While we emphasize on the production of commodity and promotion of trade as an engine of growth, we must emphasize on green economy for achieving 2030 agenda for sustainable development goals. A perfect alignment of trade and investment with climate action is a great challenge for us. Formulating an action plan for this pressing issue requires extensive studies, survey, research, analysis, and above all, smart recommendations. My gratitude to ESCAP, UNCTAD, and UNFP for the innovative approach to bring the climate smart trade investment matter to the forefront. distinguished chair and dear colleagues. I had the chance to go through the summary of the report. It has imparted me some of the basic ideas and aspirations that our national governments have ample scope to formulate climate smart business and investment policy. With regards to ensure welfare of the people, the report includes one of the vital elements that more jobs would be created in clean energy. Energy efficiency, engineering, manufacturing, and construction industries, and the new numbers of jobs will outnumber the estimated loss of jobs by downstream industries. To me, the recommendations in the report, like trade liberalization in climate smart and other environmental goals, phasing out fossil fuel, subsidy, private sector initiative, transition to climate-friendly transportation, incorporation of climate issues in regional trade agreement, carbon pricing and carbon border adjustment taxes are very much befitting given the crisis we are facing. Dear colleagues, I would like to appraise some of the developments in home front. Bangladesh has already converted a good number of factories into green industries. The Ministry of Commerce, alongside with the Ministry of Industries and Climate, are working in unison to sensitize governments, agencies, and private sectors for transforming to climate smart trade and investment. Our Honorable Prime Minister is a champion of this cause, and she was awarded the UN's highest environment accolade, Champion of the Earth, in recognition of Bangladesh's far-reaching initiative to address climate. We are hopeful to utilize the essence of the trade and investment. Distinguished Chair and guests, we are committed to increase our trade and investment-centric growth for the benefit of our contemporary citizens, but we are also aware that we inherited this globe from our ancestors. Therefore, we should be equally committed to our progeny to give them a better world to live in, and this we can only do by our collective and concerted efforts in our climate smart consideration in the areas of trade and investment. I wish the launching event great success. I thank you all.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. I now ask Mr. Jan de Wol, Chief of Trade Policy and Facilitation Section, ESCAP's Trade, Investment and Innovation Division, as well as the main driving force behind this report, to present an overview of this report and its main findings. We can't hear you yet.
Okay, I hope you can see me, you can hear me, and you can also see the presentation, correct?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you very much. So it's very much a pleasure to present this Asia Pacific Trade and Investment Report 2021 on accelerating climate smart trade and investment for sustainable development as a joint product of ESCAP, UNEP, and UNTAD. And it's really a first for APTIR to bring all three organizations together to discuss such an important topic. The premises of the report is really that while globalization has lifted millions, or in fact billions of people out of poverty in the Asia Pacific region alone, at the same time, the economic growth generated by trade and investment policies also come at a steep environmental cost and has contributed to climate change. The Asia Pacific region accounts for about 40% of the global GDP, but also account now for about 54% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And so, as the Executive Secretary of ESCAP mentioned, the new IPCC reports highlight that climate change is man-made, is widespread, is rapid, and it's intensifying. So action needs to be taken now. And so this report is really focused on how trade and investment related policies can be more climate smart. And in fact, so what this means is that how trade investment related policies can help address climate change a little bit more directly. So I'm not going to go through the whole report chapter by chapter, but here you can see an overview. You're all invited to go to the link and open it and read it. Chapter 1 really sets the stage on explaining how important trade investment in relation to climate change is, trying to explain the complex linkages between climate change, trade, and investment. In fact, chapter 2 is really trying to do a stock taking on how climate smart at this time trade and investment is in Asia and the Pacific region. And then chapter 3, 4, and 5 focus on more specific issues. So chapter 3 focuses on climate smart business and investment. Chapter 4 focuses on regional trade agreement, the role of regional trade agreements to promote climate smart trade and for investment. Chapter 5 looks at climate smart trade and transport facilitation very specifically. And then chapter 6 try to do a quantify some of the impact associated with different policy scenarios, including fuel subsidies and carbon pricing, different carbon pricing mechanisms. And so chapter 7 concludes with recommendation. So what I will do in this presentation is really focus on the recommendations. But first, let me say that when we did the stock taking, right, on climate smart trade investment, we did find that all countries have room to make trade and investment climate smarter. Obviously, some countries are more advanced than others in this area, and New Zealand being one of them. But still, every country has room to do something to make their trade investment more aligned and more supportive of climate action. So the Asia-Pacific region made some progress. The good news is the Asia-Pacific region made some progress since 2015. But again, both for example, on the import and the export side of trade in environmental goods, also on improving energy efficiency, which is important to make the investment environment more climate smart, and also in terms of trade facilitation and trade digitalization. So still lots of room for improvement. So we have 10 recommendations in the report, so I will go through them one by one. So the first one is to liberalize trade in climate smart and other environmental goods and services. When we look at the data for the Asia Pacific region, we find that average tariffs applied on carbon intensive fuels in Asia Pacific are lower than tariff applied on the environmental goods. So obviously, as you can see in the graph, it varies from one country to another, but for the region as a whole, this trend is there, and so this trend needs to be reversed. And countries can take action on liberalizing trade in climate smart goods unilaterally, bilaterally, regionally, or even better at the multilateral level. The second recommendation that comes out is to fade out fossil fuel subsidies. So I think you've heard the message from the two ministers from New Zealand very loud and clear in that area, and some of the quantitative analysis we have in the report in the chapter 6 really show that phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, removing them, is really a win-win, and is something that is really should be done as quickly as possible. At this stage, Asia-Pacific economies spend more than $175 billion still on fossil fuel subsidies, and so but then cutting them can actually give fiscal space for the governments, but also this funds, right, can also be used better, more directly to support the people in need. The third recommendations we have in the report is to adopt climate smart non-tariff measures. So at this point in time, Asia-Pacific economies apply climate-related non-tariff measures to only 6.2% of their imports. So not much use of climate smart NTMs. One example of a non-tariff measure for example, in China, is to put technical requirements on the efficiency of light bulbs that are being imported into the country. So those kind of technical requirements support higher level of energy efficiency, and is something that may be considered in different countries across the regions. The fourth recommendation is to encourage climate smart investment and private sector initiatives. So this is really a big topic all by itself. There is really a need for transforming key sectors, key economic sectors, to make them more climate smart. So this will take really a lot of energy and effort. And then the report identified 4 sectors, priority sectors, to really in which we can take action, right? The energy sector, which is really a fundamental sector that is also supporting all the other sectors, right, is key. And so one of the action that needs to be taken is to increase the share of renewables in the energy sector and reduce CO2 emissions in that sector. Industrial sector is also very important. Production of cement, iron, steel is very much CO2 intensive, and so there is need to adapt and adopt new technologies in this area. The transport sector itself is very important, and in fact, we're going to talk a bit more about it later. But there is different actions that can be taken, one of which is to invest in cleaner modes of transport and technologies. And then the construction sector is also found to be one of the key sectors in which climate smart investment needs to be done. Greening buildings, making sure the materials being used in constructions are supportive of climate change mitigation. So at the same time, in that chapter, we also highlight private sector initiatives that can be taken. Some of them can be pushed by government policies, such as sustainability reporting requirements. But some big companies are already taking actions also on their own, for example, by setting up internal carbon pricing mechanisms, so that when they make investment decisions, they already put a price on carbon, even though the markets where they're operating don't have a price on carbon. So this way they can make a little bit more climate-friendly decisions on the investment side. Maybe we're going to hear about this from the private sector in the panel. The fifth recommendation is to accelerate trade digitalization. Right? So there's quite a lot of information on the report about how trade digitalization can support reduction in CO2 emissions. One of the findings we have is that if you go from the current relatively inefficient set of trade procedures to full paperless trade or trade digitalization, for each transactions, you can save the equivalent of the emissions captured by 1.5 trees, right? So it looks very small like this, but if you multiply it by all the trade transactions taking place in Asia Pacific, you're talking about the equivalent of 400 million trees. So the impact is still significant. The sixth recommendation, right, is to transition to climate smart transport. So every time we think about international trade and climate change, the first thing that comes to mind is transport, right? International transport. CO2 emissions from freight transport have been estimated to account about 42% of all transport-related CO2 emissions, including both domestic and international freight. So it's not only related to international transport. And so there is half of a chapter fully dedicated to greening trade logistics through digital and smart transport systems. There's a framework presented called the Enable, Avoid, Shift, Improve framework, but also there is emphasis and discussion of the importance of digitalizing transport processes in the report, as well as the importance of also regional approaches that can be very useful to facilitate interoperability of transport infrastructure, both the physical hard transport infrastructure, but also the soft infrastructure. The seventh recommendation is to incorporate climate considerations in regional trade and investment agreements. So obviously, it's great if some of this can be done at the WTO and at the multilateral level, but we've seen that some countries are already starting to do this, to integrate climate-related provisions into regional trade agreement. In particular, after 2005, this has become more common, as you can see on the graph here. There is scope for doing a lot more in this area, for deepening the provision in this area. And one of the agreements supported by New Zealand in collaboration with Costa Rica, Fiji, Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland on climate change, trade, and sustainability can provide good guidance, I think, in this area. And hopefully we'll hear about this in the panel. The 8th recommendation is to prepare for carbon pricing. Right? At this stage, the Asia-Pacific region hasn't done too much in terms of carbon pricing. Only 7.8% of emissions in the regions are covered by carbon pricing, compared to about 21.5% globally. Right? So still there is quite a number of things to be done in that area. And then definitely this is happening. Right? So carbon pricing is coming. The cost of carbon will have to be accounted for more and more in Asia Pacific and the rest of the world. And so countries need to be to prepare for that, regardless of their level of development. And so, in fact, we've done some analysis. This is from chapter 6 on when we try to look at the impact of different policy scenarios. We do find that existing carbon pricing comes at an economic cost for the sub-region we implement them. Right? This is not surprising, right? And but with a marginal windfall to sub-regions not implementing them at this point because of carbon leakage, right? Basically, some of the production and the activities move from sub-regions who actually put a price on carbon to some of the regions and countries who don't put a price on carbon. But obviously, it's temporary measures. The countries who are putting in place carbon pricing mechanism are starting to take action to stop this carbon leakage. And one example is the European Union, right, with implementing its carbon border adjustment mechanism now. And so in the report, we look at the impact of the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism, the potential impact. The good news is the experience, the impact of the CBAM on the region as a whole and the GDP is very limited, except for South and Southwest Asia. What we also find in the report in terms of quantifying and looking at the impact of different policies is that imposing a global carbon price of just $10, so very small one, actually is very effective in reducing emissions. So definitely the global approach, the global carbon price approach is the best, but extremely difficult to put in place. And one of the findings we have in the report is that the global price of carbon of $50 is really a minimum to actually have a hope to reach some of the climate change goals, that are listed in the Paris Agreement. So, but at the same time, what we also find is that putting a price on carbon has a cost. So we find that the GDP, with a global carbon price of $50, the GDP will decline in Asia and the Pacific by 0.2 to 0.64, 0.7%. Right? So there is a cost, and obviously that means developing countries will need support in adopting some of those policies. The 9th recommendation is to incorporate climate considerations in COVID-19 crisis recovery packages. Right? So this report was done at the time of, in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. At this time, a lot of countries, or the countries who can afford it, are actually putting in place COVID-19 recovery spending and very big packages sometimes. And it's very important that those incorporate climate change aspect and incorporate climate actions. So an obvious example would be, for example, to invest in transport technologies and transport measures that are less CO2 emitting, right? Railway compared to road transport, for example, right? But there is some limitation in the current trade rules at the multilateral level and others that may make this a bit difficult. So it would be good if at the multilateral levels this can be facilitated somehow. And let me end with the 10th recommendation we have there, is really the recognition that capacity for climate smart trade and investment policy needs to be strengthened. And the minister, honorable minister from Bangladesh, made this point very clear. You need a lot of research and analysis in order to actually come up with the optimal climate smart trade and investment policies, the one that will keep trade going as an engine of growth and at the same time protect the environment. Right? So for this, there's a need for to build the capacity of policymakers and analysts, and so specific capacity building programs will need to be put in place. And so ESCAP, UNEP, and UNCTAD really stand ready to support this. So let me stop here and encouraging you to all read the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Duval. We now have reached the panel discussion segment of the event. I welcome our distinguished panelists and Mr. Aik-Ho Lim, Director of Trade and Environment of WTO, will moderate this session. Mr. Lim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alexei. And firstly, I'd like to thank ESCAP and UNEP and UNCTAD for this invitation to help moderate this panel. Firstly, of course, also to Jan and to the colleagues, Alexei and others, for this excellent report. Really congratulations for your work on accelerating climate smart trade and investment for sustainable development. I think we already heard quite a bit this morning in the opening remarks, but maybe just very quickly before going to this very distinguished panel, I should mention at the outset that the bios for the panelists are available, and I will introduce them very quickly. But just to set some scenes for the discussion, I think what we heard from Jan and from others confirm what most of us, I think, instinctively already know, which is that climate change is here, and that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has really confirmed this. But one only has to look at the news to realize that many regions of the world are experiencing extreme weather patterns. This is having deadly consequences on human populations, and so forth. And at the root of all of this is the question, to what extent has human activity contributed? And the Intergovernmental Panel has made it very clear that human activity has contributed. And perhaps a more important question is, to what extent can we mitigate and adapt to climate change? The good news, of course, is that the panel has also spoken of how deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions could still stabilize rising temperatures, and that this work can still be done. And it requires very significant changes by governments, businesses, consumers, all of us essentially, to decarbonize the economy. Next month, we have COP26, many expectations on that conference to lift up to the expectations of the 2015 Paris Agreement, looking towards strengthen, or let's say enhance, climate ambition. And in this, there's always this question, what can international trade and investment do? How can trade and all the organizations working on trade, as well as national governments, play their part in delivering in support of a decarbonized future? So again, this report is certainly very timely. It's really laid out different pathways. You heard from Jan very clearly and very succinctly the different pathways that can be considered. Some of these are pathways that we at WTO have been discussing for some time as well, including making climate-friendly goods and services cheaper, more accessible by reducing tariffs, non-tariff barriers, other methods to support transition towards a low-carbon economy, looking towards how trade can support climate-friendly alternatives, and so forth. But clearly, as Jan has also mentioned, and so have the distinguished speakers earlier, very significant challenges. For one, the scale of investment that would be required is massive. There's of course going to be growth and jobs created by the transition, but there will also be losses And so in all of this, the question of how to be inclusive and how to ensure a just transition, especially for developing countries, always comes to the fore, especially when we consider the international trade dimensions. So that, as I said, this is only a very brief sort of context setting and in a way a recap of many things you've probably already heard. So with this, let me turn to the first panelist that I have on the panel, which is Ms. Claire Kelly, Assistant Secretary of the Trade and Economic Group at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. It's a great pleasure to welcome Claire. We crossed paths many years ago now when Claire was at the WTO. So very good to see you again, Claire. You know, Claire, from what you've heard this morning, can you help us to give some, let's say, concrete examples of actionable best practices in terms of climate smart trade and investment policy that New Zealand is undertaking or is advocating? So thank you so much, Claire. I should mention we have about something like 7 minutes per panelist. So look forward to your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and good evening from New Zealand. Thank you very much to ESCAP in the first instance for the invitation to join the panel tonight, and thank you for that very interesting question. You've heard already our ministers, Ministers O'Connor and Shaw, speak on the subject, and I will expound a little on some of the issues that they raised. I mean, as we've heard from all the speakers today and from perusing the report, there's no doubt that the Asia-Pacific economies need to take urgent action, urgent climate action to protect livelihoods as well as maintain trade competitiveness in this very volatile global environment. And global greenhouse emissions have to halve by 2030 if we're to meet the temperature goals set out in the Paris Agreement. And New Zealand's strong and long-held view is that trade policy has a vital role to play in supporting efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change. The Asia-Pacific Trade and Investment Report recommends a number of actions that economies could adopt, as we heard earlier, and we're very pleased to note that New Zealand is a proponent of implementing such measures. Firstly, we're a long-standing champion of trade policy action to phase out and eliminate environmentally harmful environmentally harmful subsidies, including agricultural, fisheries and fossil fuel subsidies. And while the first two, agriculture and fisheries subsidies, are active topics of discussion in the WTO, in WTO processes, advancing action on fossil fuel subsidy reform has been a slower task. And it's not for want of attention or acknowledgement of the issue. The G20, the APEC economies have committed to action on fossil fuel subsidies since 2009. And since then, they and others, such as the Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform, the Pacific Island Forum leaders and the G7, have issued statements calling for the phase out of fossil fuel subsidies. All UN country member countries have endorsed the need for fossil fuel subsidy reform in the Sustainable Development Goals, and the World Health Organization has recognized fossil fuel subsidies reform as one of the prescriptions for a green pandemic recovery. So it's very clear that without addressing the issue of fossil fuel use, we won't be able to reach the goals set out in the Paris Agreement. This is why, in New Zealand's case, in addition to our own domestic review and reform of indirect support measures, we continue to actively advocate for fossil fuel subsidy reform internationally. In addition to environmental fora, we also look to advance this issue in trade and economic institutions. This is because, as the report describes, these subsidies affect trade and investment decisions and the competitive environment for renewable energy. Reform of fossil fuel subsidies is therefore a key policy tool for internalising the environmental cost of greenhouse gas emissions. The first place we're looking to drive this conversation is at the WTO, of course, which is well equipped to develop disciplines to address such subsidies, given its existing legal frameworks and transparency mechanisms. And as Minister O'Connor mentioned before, New Zealand is once again leading a joint ministerial statement on fossil fuel subsidy reform at the upcoming 12th Ministerial Conference. Our work in this regard is intended to continue building a supportive international setting for addressing fossil fuel subsidies multilaterally, as well as to assist domestic reform efforts. On the latter point, we recognise that reform of fossil fuel subsidies must take account of specific needs and conditions of developing countries and minimise the potential adverse impacts on their development, such as those reductions of GDP in the Asia-Pacific region referred to in the report summary. And we think that by encouraging information sharing and experiences of reform at the WTO, our ultimate aim can be to achieve transparent and effective disciplines in a multilateral setting. We've already welcomed WTO members such as the European Union and Fiji as co-sponsors of our joint statement, and I encourage Asia-Pacific members to consider supporting this initiative ahead of MC12. We need diverse views and experiences to ensure robust and long-lasting outcomes. Secondly, or a second front on which New Zealand is looking to advance our work on climate smart trade policy is through our host year of APEC. We're taking advantage of this opportunity to prioritise the region's most pressing issues, which include building climate smart economies through championing policies that are mutually supportive of economic and climate change objectives. And as the region's premier economic cooperation forum, APEC is well placed to promote trade and economic policies that help address climate change and support an environmentally sustainable recovery from the pandemic and associated economic crisis. So to this end, in this year, New Zealand has been calling on all APEC member economies to commit to a voluntary standstill on inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. This is a practical step that members can take to fulfil APEC's pledge to rationalise and phase out such subsidies. And we were very heartened to see APEC ministers responsible for trade support this call in June and commit their officials to explore options for such a standstill. As we saw from Mr. Duval's presentation, there's never been a more important moment for APEC to demonstrate leadership on this issue, given that the 21 APEC member economies account for roughly 3/5 of the planet's greenhouse gas emissions, as well as 3/5 of global energy consumption. And beyond our host year, New Zealand will look at how we work with future APEC hosts to hold the region accountable to its long-held pledge to tackle inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. In addition to the work around fossil fuel subsidies, we've also taken the opportunity to advance discussions on an APEC list of environmentally related services. And this work is an important contribution to global discussions of how we advance trade in those services that can benefit the environment. Similarly, we've also led a process of updating APEC's work on environmental goods. APEC has an impressive trade record in this area already. The APEC list of 54 environmental goods has been a benchmark for informing environmental goods discussions in other international fora, including in the WTO. And this year, we're working on updating this list of environmental goods to further inform discussions on how trade can contribute to green growth. New Zealand's host year will culminate in the Economic Leaders Week from 8 to 12 November, which is very soon. And given that will happen shortly after COP26, the Leaders Week will be a really timely opportunity for APEC economies to signal what we as a region are committed to do to champion a climate resilient future. Mr. Duval mentioned another agreement that New Zealand is working on in addition to our multilateral and regional efforts, and I'll just speak quickly to that. That is the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, or the ACTS initiative with a group of 6 other like-minded countries. The Acts explicitly uses trade rules and practices to support sustainable development and climate goals. And the 4 pillars of the Acts are once again well aligned with the recommendations of the report that we're discussing today. The Acts is looking to liberalise trade in environmental goods and services, develop binding disciplines to eliminate harmful fossil fuel subsidies, and develop best practice guidelines for voluntary eco-labelling schemes. We see it as a practical demonstration of adapting trade rules and practices to achieve mutually supportive trade and sustainable development objectives. And once concluded, we envisage that the Acts will expand into a multilateral initiative open to WTO members that are prepared to meet the standards of the agreement. Finally, I'd like to note that the Asia Pacific Trade and Investment Report 2021's findings that regional trade agreements can help address climate change. Empirical evidence suggests that environmental provisions in free trade agreements do promote green exports, and we were very pleased to see that confirmed in the report. As a member of the CPTPP, New Zealand has adopted environmental provisions requiring parties to effectively enforce domestic environmental law, and we're continuing to seek ambitious language in our ongoing FTA negotiations. So I'll conclude here by saying that as we're all hearing today, we're at a crucial moment of both risk and opportunity. And as economies implement significant fiscal stimulus packages to respond to the pandemic and stimulate recovery, we will need to take climate considerations. We'll have to have climate considerations in mind. Otherwise, there is a risk that we lock in emissions-intensive pathways well into the future. However, these packages do also provide an opportunity to accelerate the transformation to cleaner and greener energy systems. So we will be looking to take a longer-term view, and we'll look forward to working with all countries in the region to adopt climate-smart trade policies. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate tonight.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary Kelly. That was really a very good illustration of all the things that we've been talking about in terms of concrete initiatives. Let me now invite Her Excellency Ambassador Pimchanuk Vongkopon Pitfield, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Thailand. Great pleasure to have you join the panel. In light of what we've heard so far, maybe I could ask you from the perspective of Thailand, what are the opportunities you see for Thailand to mainstream climate change through trade-related policy? And what are some of the challenges that are faced in doing so? So thank you very much, Your Excellency. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you the ESCAP who invited me to speak today, as well as to the UN, UNCTAD, and of course the New Zealand government who has kindly sponsored this seminar today, and also thanks to the WTO Secretariat. I think because I have 7 minutes, so I will go rather quickly. I would also I want to start on Thailand experience with the UNFCCC a little bit, and then go on to talk about how we have been trying to implement our commitments there. And I would also touch on some of the recommendations that Mr. Duval, hello to Bangkok, he has laid out some recommendations, which I have some comments on those recommendations. So very quickly, Thailand is accounted for about 0.9% of the greenhouse gas emission in the world, which is totaling about 331 million ton carbon dioxide per year. We have joined the UNFCCC in 1994, and in 2002 we have ratified the Kyoto Protocol So we are fully committed to reducing the greenhouse gas commitment. In 2014, we have submitted our nationally appropriate mitigation actions, or the so-called NAMA plan, to the COP, and we have been trying to lay out our mitigation plan in order to meet the commitment. Our mitigation plan is divided into three stages. The medium, the short term, which is between before 2020, we have made up a target point at to reduce greenhouse gas in energy and transport to between 7 to 20%. And I'm happy to report that last year we have achieved the target. We have exceeded the target set for last year when we when we reduced 17% of the business as usual level. So it exceeded our own target, and I think that was a very good achievement. For the medium term, we will focus on reducing further greenhouse gas level in energy, transport, and second area we will focus on will be waste management, and thirdly on the industrial and the product usage. We will try to go to that. And in the long run, which is between 2030 to 2050, Thailand is in the process of submitting to our cabinet the long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategy. Again, this long-term plan will focus on greenhouse gas in energy and transport as a core sectors, but we also will focus on the other green or support measures in agriculture sector, in forestry, and some other areas. The main direction will of transition will focus on 4Ds and 1E. 4Ds are the decarbonization, digitalization, decentralization, and deregulation, and these will be complemented by 1E, which is electrification of the power and transport in Thailand. Quickly going through the our policy in investment, which is the main vehicle where Thailand wants to go through this, and also the private sector. I think the private sector in Thailand, as well as the government plan, we will focus on what we call the BCG framework, policy framework. This is bioeconomy, the circular economy, and the green economy. All these will contribute to the Thailand target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But I must say that they are very broad policy framework, and not this will complement the national plan to reduce greenhouse gas as our commitment under UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. The BCG model is implemented by the private sector, especially the industrial sectors in Thailand. On the government side, apart from Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Agriculture, who are two main governmental agencies responsible for the greenhouse gas reduction plan, and also Ministry of Industry, sorry, so there are three. We also have two investment related agencies who are very actively promoting investment in the environmental goods and services investment into Thailand. They are the Board of Investment and the Eastern Economic Corridor agencies. These two government agencies, they have laid out plans to attract investment into Thailand. I will not go through it because we don't have time. Just I want to say that apart from the brown measures such as waste management, mitigation, and also investment promotion, Thailand is now embarking on other additional measures, particularly in financial instruments that would help us assist private sectors and business to combat and to meet the target of the greenhouse gas. I have only 1 minute. Please allow me to make comments on some of the recommendations that Dr. Duval has put out. I think that for environment measures, of course, I share with him that and you, Mr. Lim, I think we have met before when you were in Asia. The ESG, of course, we still need to discuss further, either at the WTO or APEC or any other forum. The definition and scope, I think it has expanded and changed quite a lot. But I'm still hopeful that we can come to common conclusions. You know, I used to do trade and environment issues in 1994, and I think that now 2020 things have changed quite a lot. The climate change commitments are more complicated than the trade and environment discussion. We should start on that. But my strong point that I want to make here as a developing country member is that in order to meet the target of greenhouse gas or anything, it is quite difficult for developing countries because we lack technology. You know, we talk about how to phase out fossil fuels and how to go to more electrification of products and services and stuff. But like Thailand, even if we are a major automobile exporting country in the world, we have not been able to switch to the electric vehicle as fast as we hope for, because there's no technology in the country. You know, all of our car manufacturers are foreign enterprises, and I think that transfer technology in anything, in the mitigation, in the producing, even solar cells or car, or anything that is more climate friendly, has to focus too on how to make transfer technology reality. And I think that I will finish here. I'm running out of time. I think there's no one size fits all policy for every country. You know, while we share the broad overall target of achieving reduction of greenhouse gas, how to get there is very dependent on each country's natural endowment, you know, where we are in the stage of development, that kind of thing. So we need to have think about capacity building, which is not a one size fits all. And we have to share information, share experiences, and share technology, and also the capacity building should be a little bit more fitting to each country's needs. That's all I would have to say at this stage. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thanks for all those remarks, and also for bringing into perspective the issues of capacity building and the need for technology transfer, and also giving us a sort of on the ground sectoral explanation of the initiatives that Thailand is really engaged in at the domestic level. Let me turn now to Mr. Noor Muhammad Mahbubul Haq. I hope I got that right. Additional Secretary of the Government of Bangladesh. Mr. Noor, I think, you know, we've heard quite a bit about climate action, a little bit about trade policy. So if we could look at these questions, particularly this relationship of trade policy and climate action, and maybe focusing a bit more on the obstacles that are there, or let's say challenges in using trade policy for climate action, for LDCs, graduating economies, and what type of support would you need in this area to enable the green transition? Thank you very much, Mr. Noor.
Thank you very much. Honorable Chairperson, Excellencies, distinguished panel discussants, respected participants, ladies and gentlemen. A very good afternoon to you all from Bangladesh. Let me thank you for having me here at this global launch of Asia Pacific Trade and Investment Report 2021, titled Accelerating Climate Smart Trade and Investment for Sustainable Development. Actually, I will be focusing on the Bangladesh perspective. So climate change is no longer something to happen in future. It is here and happening now. Bangladesh is one of the world's most climate vulnerable countries and will become even more so as a result of climate change. Floods, tropical cyclones, storm surge, and droughts are likely to become more frequent and severe in the coming years. Bangladesh is located along the coast of Bay of Bengal, and the major part of the country lies on the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna River Delta, the Asia's largest and the world's most populated delta. This makes it especially vulnerable to climate change, with 1/3 of its population at risk of displacement because of rising sea level. According to the Global Climate Risk Index, Bangladesh ranks among the top 10 countries in the world's most affected by extreme weather events during 1998 and 2017. Rising sea levels and coastal erosion could lead to a loss of 17% of total surface and 30% of food production by 2050, according to the experts from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a body of the United Nations. Recognizing the urgency of the issue, the government of Bangladesh has become one of the most active actors in terms of planning and taking actions to face the climate change challenges. Although Bangladesh is one of the least greenhouse gas emitters, but still the country took several measures in recent years to promote climate change investments. Among these is adopting a fiscal framework designed to channel more resources towards adoption investments. At the same time, new environmental guidelines promote green financing, foster green banking, and establish dedicated funds. Bangladesh is also active in seeking grant financing from the international community, notably through the Green Climate Fund. During the period of 2016 to 2020, the government of Bangladesh has invested on an average $1.3 billion annually from the domestic sources for financing climate change. Excellencies and distinguished participants, Bangladesh is considered as an emerging tiger of Asia due to its recent economic achievements. During the last decade, under the visionary and dynamic leadership of our Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, Bangladesh has achieved remarkable economic progress in line with the dream of our father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, to build a hunger and poverty-free Bangladesh. The average growth rate was consistently above 10% during the last decade, and recording highest of 8.15% in the financial year 2018 and 19. Bangladesh is all set to graduate from LDC status. Excellencies, there is no denying that economic growth comes with significant social and environmental costs. The vision of the government of Bangladesh is to eradicate poverty and achieve economic and social well-being for all the people. This will be achieved through pro-poor climate change strategy, which prioritizes adoption and disaster risk reduction, and also addresses low carbon development, mitigation, technology transfer, and provision of adequate finance. In this regard, Bangladesh has already adopted Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy Plan in 2019, which is under implementation for a period of 25 years. The Climate Change Action Plan is built on 6 pillars. First, food security, social protection and health. Second, comprehensive disaster management. Third, infrastructure. Fourth, research and knowledge management. 5, mitigation and low carbon development. 6, capacity building and institutional strengthening. So before I conclude, I would like to congratulate and thank Rian Duval, the Chief of the Policy and Trade Facilitation, ESCAP, for excellent presentation and taking us through the Asia Pacific Trade and Investment Report 2021 on accelerating climate smart and investment for sustainable development. I think the report has touched and taken care of all the environmental climate change issues we need to look into for achieving sustainable development goal. I strongly believe that the recommendation will help the governments and policymakers to take informed decision. Trade and investment is the engine of growth, but we must emphasize on green economy for achieving 2030 SDG. Wishing you all a good health. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Noor. Thank you for also reflecting on the challenges that Bangladesh faces, which is not, I think, unique to Bangladesh, but also to many LDCs. And as you said, contributing the least to greenhouse gas emissions, but facing a lot of challenges and climate change impacts, but still being positive in terms of the climate action that you are trying to bring about. So thank you for that. Let me turn now to then we have 3 more speakers and we are running out of time due to my very bad timekeeping. But in any case, I think we have 3 very interesting speakers. The next is Mr. Butt Dar, who is Executive Vice President of Maritime Policy and Government Affairs of the MSC Group. Now, Mr. Dar, as you and I'm sure many of us who work in trade, we always hear from people that when they think about trade and climate change, they think often about emissions from transport, and whilst the report shows that transport is only one part of the emissions in the trade and supply chains, and there's also quite a lot that can be done to improve efficiency and to improve the dissemination of green technologies through transport. How do you see this role, this relationship between transport and climate change, and do we fully understand the positives and negatives of the role of transport in trade and climate change? Thank you, Mr. Dar.
Well, thank you, and it's really my pleasure to join the other distinguished guests and speakers this morning or this evening, depending on where you are. It's my great honor to address these topics with you. So first of all, let me say MSC Group is the 2nd largest container operating line in the world. We also operate 19 ocean-going ferries and 19 modern cruise ships as well, and then the infrastructure to facilitate intermodal transportation that connects with that as well. So our core business is connecting the world, and we serve as a conduit for trade, and we simply provide services where the demand is there for that trade to occur, and whether that's to serve the needs of a particular country through their imports, or whether it's to facilitate their economy through their exports, we basically adapt our networks to provide what is needed. And you've seen a huge amount of adaptation through the pandemic here. And I want to take a moment to particularly thank our seafarers, many of which come from the Asia Pacific region, for the absolutely heroic work they did in allowing to keep commerce flowing and keep the ships moving. And I would encourage all of us to continue to think about their well-being and facilitating their ability to continue to do their incredibly important work to all of us. When it comes to climate change, shipping accounts internationally for between 2 and 3% of the overall anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions by most estimates, and you can work with the number one way or the other, but it usually lands somewhere between 2 and 3%. And that is a significant amount, and shipping must do its part. Shipping must decarbonize, and not just partially decarbonize. And what you have started to see emerging in the public domain, although it's been happening in the background for quite some time, is that's now become mainstream thinking of ship owners and the associations that represent them for 2050. And so a vast number of ship owners, including my company in particular, and the associations that represent them and coalitions that they have gathered around, have started to visibly support a net zero for 2050 target. Why do I say that? It's because although we must continue to provide the services if trade is going to continue to function properly, we appreciate as ship owners that we have to do our part. We have to be very close with the other stakeholders trying to decarbonize society, and that is going to be difficult. It is going to be transformational for our industry, for the shipping industry. It is the single largest challenge we have ever faced by far. And in my opinion, it is the largest challenge we will ever face. It is truly an existential sort of issue for us. And we have to make progress even faster than we thought before. So one thing I'll mention about decarbonization against the baseline of full decarbonization is really where we have to get to, and I think that the policymakers will gravitate around that here very soon, is that it has the potential to have some rather disproportionate impacts on certain cultures and certain regions and certain nations. So I think that if you think about the value of avoiding emission of a gram of CO2 or other greenhouse gases in one place versus another, it's different than localized pollutants. Because if I avoid that in one place, whether it's Papua New Guinea or Tokyo, Japan, it really has the same effect overall on protecting the environment as avoiding that in New York or Rotterdam or Southampton. So any place we can actually avoid those emissions has the same benefit for society. So as developing countries and those particularly in the Asia Pacific region and the small island developing states, which I think are particularly vulnerable both to the effects of climate change, but also to some degree to the effects of mitigating climate change from transport, which is absolutely essential to the well-being of the people. There is maybe some synergy there because the efforts to avoid from transport those emissions locally through maybe capacity building and assistance which comes from other developed countries or other funding sources can actually have the same benefit throughout the whole planet, but yet help those less capable countries economically still contribute their fair share with a little bit of assistance. And I think that there's a balance to be found there. I think it's important, and I think we should look at that. What I think is important is that we focus revenues that are generated from various regulatory regimes that are out there, including maybe ending subsidies of certain fossil fuels towards renewing the fuel supply chain towards the truly decarbonized solutions that we need for the future. I'm pretty confident that the shipboard technology side will get where it needs to get to, and ship owners will certainly invest in that. But what we don't control and what we're not particularly good at, we have no expertise in it, is actually developing the fuels, developing the infrastructure to deliver them, and making sure that they go to transport. So that work is particularly urgent, must begin today. And at the end of the day, the cost to do this, which for shipping to fully decarbonize will certainly be trillions of dollars, most of which is probably on the shore side component, needs to be shared through the supply and value chain. So those costs must be passed on, or else we won't have businesses to run anymore. That's a cold reality that we all must face. And I think getting into that mindset today, finding how we're going to make that both physically, technologically feasible as well as economically feasible while still allowing particularly smaller economies to function properly and feed and clothe and take care of their populations is extremely important, and that work cannot begin soon enough. We want to be great partners in that, and it's really been my pleasure to share a few thoughts. I hope you found them helpful.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dar, from the perspective of transport and shipping. I think you raised many questions that we will need to have further discussions on, even specifically on the issue of international transport and shipping, and certainly some very interesting ideas here of how to better share the costs, as you said, of the transition. Let me turn to the next speaker, which is Madame Shamika Siriman, who is Director of the Division on Technology and Logistics from UNCTAD. It's very much keeping in line with what we started on international transport, but bringing in another dimension, which we already heard, which is digitalization. And so what do you see as the role of digital trade and trade digitalization in making trade more climate smart, and also in this case, of course, helping the COVID-19 recovery. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me take the opportunity to thank this very relevant and pertinent Asia Pacific Trade and Investment Report of 2021 on climate smart trade and investments. You see, I mean, we all know Asia Pacific is a trading region, and it is export-led growth that has lifted millions out of poverty. It is not trickle down, it's just basically export-led growth. So trade and investment remain essential to the region. But on the other hand, having lived in mega cities of Asia and visited several more, I also know at a very deep personal level how much we worry about our cities, and these are also the industrial centers, that they stay livable. So this is a concern, and there is no option but to be climate smart. I think our additional secretary of Bangladesh, pointed out this very poignantly. So how to accelerate climate smart trade and investment is spot on addressing these dual concerns. So to address your question about the role of digital trade, we all know the COVID-19 crisis has accelerated digital transformation in many areas, and e-commerce is one of them. The share of e-commerce in global retail increased from 14% to 17% of total retail from 2019 to 2020. I think a lot of these numbers are even underestimated because there's nothing called statistics for e-commerce. And e-commerce brings enormous opportunities to small and medium enterprises to connect buyers and sellers directly and cut down on the middleman. And they benefit, especially women and youth-led enterprises. So it is all very good. However, the increased air and urban transportation of small parcels, packaging and additional clearance procedures, these all add to carbon footprints. Now, then the second thing that you ask about the digital solution. So let me now bring the digital solution and to talk about how digital solutions, can become important enablers of this transition to green economy. They help improve efficiency, optimize existing processes, create new business opportunities, and also transform supply and value chains and the geography of trade. And as Jan said in his presentation, 400 million trees will be saved every year by digitalization of trade. But then when we think about digitalization, we think about half the world's population still unconnected to the internet, and we think about power outage and lack of digital skills, and this is all very true. But I want to present to you that still much can be done with even weak ICT and energy infrastructure. So let me give you two examples from our own work at UNCTAD to show that we can do a lot with what we have. Number one is this: through our ASICUDA program, we assist developing countries to modernize customs operations and automate goods clearance processes. It's a massive, sophisticated, and complex e-government platform. Bangladesh is being a founding member of the ASICUDA family, and ASICUDA is currently used in approximately 100 countries and territories, including 38 LDCs. And many of these places you do not have great connections, and electricity outage is common, but the digital platform is running with backup data centers and other contingency measures in place. So we can do things with what we have. The examples in the report of Vanuatu and Timor-Leste highlight the benefits of customs modernization on climate change. The electronic single window in Vanuatu has reduced 5,827 kilograms of carbon dioxide emissions by eliminating the use of papers just through the automation of 2 trade procedures. And in Timor-Leste, ASICUDA World has allowed for a reduction of 14,492 kilograms of CO2 emissions since it's launched in 2015. In fact, I'm very grateful to Vanuatu and Timor-Leste because very few countries track environmental implications of trade digitization. I think we need to do a lot more. You see, in addition to this, the direct impact on climate, The major benefits brought by ASICUDA include significant increases in customs revenue, which then in turn create the fiscal space for addressing climate concerns. Now, let me get to the second example. We support, at UNCTAD, we support countries to establish trade information portals and find that these portals could be an efficient tool to reduce carbon footprints. These portals increase transparency and make it easier for traders to access the information needed to fulfill also administrative and regulatory requirements. In addition, in places like Kenya and Rwanda, the trade portals have been instrumental in cutting the number of processes and procedures significantly. So, it would reduce energy consumption. It would just reduce the traders running around the town in taxis and cars to figure out what to do when you want to trade. So one of the conclusions of the report is that the link between trade facilitation and climate change is not well recognized, and which is true. And multilateral and regional trade facilitation agreements, and including WTO, as you know, these agreements do not try to exploit the potential synergy between trade facilitation and climate change efforts. So going forward, I think we need to pay more attention to this aspect and highlight that trade and transport facilitation would be good for the climate, especially digitization of trade processes and procedures would do good for the climate. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Director, for that very clear explanation of how digitalization and digital services actually helps facilitate trade, reduce red tape, and therefore contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. Now, very lastly, we have my friend and UNEP colleague, Stephen Stone, who's Chief of the UN Environment Resources and Markets Branch of UNEP. Stephen, you are the last speaker on the panel. I got an okay from the organizers to go on for a further 10 minutes, but I hope you won't use up all of that time because we need to to maybe see if there's any questions. Now, Stephen, I think you've heard many things now from the different panel. I had an original question plan, but I think, if we listen to what we've heard, and it also reflects this question here, I think what we hear is that many countries want to do the transition. Many are already in the process of doing the transition, but they also recognize that the transition is costly. A lot of investment is required. Many developing countries find these strong challenges. The ambassador spoke about capacity building, for instance, about the need for technology transfer, and others spoke about the need to share the costs and to meet the investments that are required. So very quickly, what do you think developing countries can do to leverage investment for the green transition? How can UNEP help to build synergies between donors, climate financing, aid for trade? I say UNEP, but of course it's all of us. So your reflections, please, Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Howie. It's been a great discussion so far. Really great to hear all these reflections from policymakers at the cutting edge of where change is actually happening in the private sector as well. But I'd really like your contribution as well. And a big thanks to ESCAP for the invitation to partner on this report. It's a wonderful report. We've heard a lot about it today. And Jan, thanks for walking us through it along with UNCTAD. I think this is the kind of hard-hitting research that brings the numbers forward, that sort of puts it into focus, the challenge in front of us, but also the solutions. And the 10 recommendations I found very, very apropos. So going quickly, Ho, to the question you raised about leveraging finance, mobilizing finance at scale. Well, I think we heard some of the solutions coming out in the talk today. A lot of it has to do with redirecting finance, which is currently going in the wrong direction. We heard about the approximately 400 billion a year in fossil fuel subsidies that are basically subsidizing things that are polluting the planet and making life tougher for all of us. Also, the agri-food subsidies. A week ago was the UN Food Summit, 2 weeks ago. And we did a report with FAO and UNDP, which detailed the $540 billion of support that goes to agri-food, a lot of it, over 2/3 of which is harmful to human health and to the environment. And then if you add in fish subsidies as well, which are around anywhere between 20 and 40 billion a year, depending on how you measure it, you're getting up to almost $1 trillion a year worth of subsidies. And these are just direct costs or foregone revenues. This doesn't include the full cost of the subsidies. If you follow the work of IMF, they estimate the externalities on fossil fuel subsidies around $6 trillion a year. So really subsidies are, in a way, the issue which has been hanging around for a long time. I know this has been on the front burner for WTO for many years because fish and fossil fuel subsidies make their way in there. But perhaps 2021, 22 is the year when we can make a breakthrough. And here I just would like to commend the leadership of New Zealand and other countries which are making this a priority. We also heard a very interesting statistic about how to leverage trade as an enabler of the climate transition. And I thought the finding, Jan, from the report of, more than half the countries have lower fossil fuel tariffs than environmental goods tariffs was frankly, it was shocking. That seems very outdated. I'm sure there are reasons for that. And we heard some very good interventions from Bangladesh and from Thailand about the complexities around the environmental goods agreement. But frankly, from a UNEP perspective, this is something which is good for the world and ultimately good for countries. So we probably need to look at that again. The last thing I would put on the table, about leveraging resources, there's a lot of money that goes out every year just because the way budgets work. Procurement, public procurement is around 10 to 30% of GDP, depending on which country. Chatham House has estimated total public procurement around the world at $13 trillion a year, over half of which is from the global south. This is, again, are huge amounts of money. What about taking our procurement policies and making them drivers for the green transition? So money that's going out the door every year to keep our schools, our hospitals, our different institutions running and equipped. What about making those drivers of sustainability? So there's just 3 ideas around green fiscal policy and trade policy that can work. What can we do further as UNEP, as the UN, as the Bretton Woods organizations? There are many, many things. Let me just list 3 very quickly. First is, engaging with countries on policy coherence. And you and I have this discussion a lot, working from a UN environment program to the WTO. We bridge the policy conversation a lot, and that's what I hear happening today as well. We're bridging the conversation across the environment from climate to trade, which is what needs to happen. We all need to become fluent and articulate in the different languages that define the problems and, more importantly, the solutions. UNEP does this through a number of different programs. One's called PAGE, the Partnership for Action on Green Economy. Thailand is a member country of PAGE. Many countries around the world are. That's an interesting space for that policy dialogue, the coherence that can happen. The second is one that you also know about, Ho and colleagues on the call, which is TESS. TESS is an initiative with the Geneva Graduate Institute, and it supports a policy space for dialogue on environment and trade for countries who are looking to make this policy coherence a reality. And the third that I would mention are a number of different programs under the UNFCCC, such as the CTCN, the Clean Technology and Climate Network, which provides technology and capacity building for countries that might need that kind of assistance to make that technological leap that we've heard about earlier today. So really sort of helping countries make that lift to a greener transition. I think there are many different avenues, Ho, and I think the kind of discussion we've had this morning shows that that's a possibility. We just need to keep our mind focused on it. Thanks, Ho. Back over to you.
Thanks, Stephen, for being very concise, but also very clear in the possible pathways. Now, I think we've come to the formal end of the session in terms of time, but we have a little bit of a time extension. I'm looking at the questions. There's been quite an active chat and question and answer discussion going on over the Zoom chat channel. I don't think we're going to be able to have time to pick up everything, but maybe I just pick up or try to bring together some of these questions. And I think one of the questions here, which is, I'll sort of give you the questions and I'll go back to the panel for 1 minute sort of comment, and we'll finish. Now, I think some of the questions here are about what sort of message can this panel bring, or what would be your message to bring to COP26 on climate smart trade and investment? That's a very sort of big question. A second one is a little bit around this issue of transition and developing countries who need energy, and there is a crisis in the need for energy, but yet at the same time we all need to contribute to climate ambition. So how do we find a pathway forward on this? And maybe I'll just pick on another one which is interesting to the discussion, has come up quite a few times, about climate friendly goods and services and environmentally harmful subsidies. These two very direct ways which trade can contribute. And I'll just throw in a third one from Shamika about digitalization and trade facilitation. Do you see possibilities to go forward on these three areas? So a lot to ask you, very little time to give you. I'll go back to you and just ask you for your sort of final comments, if I can, on this range of comments that we've heard so far. So let me start with Claire Kelly. I hope she's still with us. Yes, Claire, please go ahead.
Did you want, I thought I might respond to the question about environmentally harmful subsidies and environmental goods and services. And as I understood the question is what can be achieved, or?
Yes, what can realistically be achieved given all the obstacles we've had so far?
Well, I think like anything else, it takes time. Well, and it takes political will over a long period of time, and that takes individuals who are interested, I think, to make sure their governments are focused on the seriousness with which their constituencies view these issues, and are taking those views forward in their positions in international fora. I think providing governments are aware of the importance of the issues, they will obviously represent them in the international dialogues that go on, and it will take time, but certainly progress can be made, and we've seen that, for example, with agricultural export subsidies. I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. I think that's true for many things. If there's a political will, we can find ways to go forward. Let me turn to the ambassador from Thailand. If I might ask Ambassador whether she had any responses to any of these questions. I'm throwing them out rather globally, not picking on any particular question for you, but whether you have any final comments. Sorry, you're muted.
Okay, I think for my final comment, I would talk about some questions that have been asked in the chat room and Q&A about development. I think for developing countries, of course, it is quite costly to go through this process. But I would urge everybody, don't despair. You know, I think climate change impact is it's felt all around the world, and this thing is it is regardless of where you are developed or developing countries, you have been affected by all these changing things. So I just want to urge everybody to be fully committed. We require political will and understanding from the top level of the policy making, because this initiative to combat climate change cannot be done by private sector alone. But my last point is that, of course, there's no one size fits all, but developing countries may need to see opportunities as well. You know, I think most of the measures or things that have been discussed here, the CBA of the EU is not new. It's nothing new. It has been here. See, even before the Uruguay round, it's the CBA, the discussion on national treatment article of the WTO has been here for ages. But so far, we have not seen clear opportunities. We have just seen only, well, stick measures, no carrots. I think we have to be able to see, okay, what we can do and what can contribute and what would be the answers to our population. If we commit to climate change, it's not only to have restrictive measures or that kind of stuff. So I just say the community may need to highlight opportunities for developing countries, and that we would be encouraged to follow through the steps. That's my final message. Thank you.
Excellent, Ambassador. I think that's great to inject this very positive energy to the discussion. And let me turn to Mr. Da for any final comments on anything that I've listed as possible questions.
Yeah, it's a long list, and we certainly could talk about this at least all day. But just to offer you a couple of thoughts on it. One is, this is not something that is potential or optional for shipping transport. It has to be done. And the policy dynamics on that are very strong, both from inside and outside the industry. I do think that in the short term, till we get the alternative fuels that we will actually need, which do not exist at scale today, that's the real problem here. We can make some further gains with energy efficiency, but by the laws of physics, that will never get us to full decarbonization. It's just a step. And part of that is, I do think digitalization tools have some real potential there, particularly with voyage optimization, to make sure that we're not transiting any faster at sea and using more energy than we need to at sea, and being very judicious with where the power consumption actually occurs. That will help. And the Digital Container Shipping Association is a good example of some of those efforts to try and optimize the supply chain. And then lastly, I'd say we've got to work together. We must work together. And the alternative fuels that shipping needs are going to be molecules, whether used for fuel or some other purpose, that will be needed for a decarbonized society overall. And so as we think about what the real solutions look like for transport, we need to cultivate and accelerate the development of those fuels and bringing them into the marketplace as aggressively as we can, not just for transport, but for transport to also be able to use them. And that will help address some of the other things that you have identified as special needs. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Da. Let me move quickly to Shamika Siriman. You've heard a lot about digitalization. Any final comments?
Yeah, thank you. I think let me also say that there is no option. We just have to address the climate change issues. It's just in our face. And it has to be done together. This is not a journey for one of us. This is a journey for our species. So this is the big picture. Now to come to digitization, yeah, the digitalization of trade processes and procedures could be a real solution. But here I also would want to put to you that still, we can do a lot of things, with the resource, with the infrastructure, feeble infrastructure that we have in developing countries, especially with LDCs that I have gave examples. But nonetheless, there is a role for development partners to pitch in, to strengthen the digital infrastructure, to strengthen digital skills and regulatory frameworks and so forth, so that countries can benefit from the digitalization. They will have a lot more jobs thrown in their way as a result of digitalization. So these opportunities, creating opportunities and creating incentives to move towards digitalization is important. And the development community, the development partners have a big role to play. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was excellent as well. And let me turn to Stephen for the last word from the panel. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ho. It's been a great panel discussion. I would just say, time to connect the dots. We're heading into Glasgow. That's in about 4 weeks' time, a little bit less. The end of the year, the MC12, the ministerial event for WTO. And this is when the things really come together. These are siloed disciplines, if you want to use that word. They are siloed events, but it's imperative that we connect the dots between and going into them. The last thing I would say, Ho, is 2022 is a big year for all of us who care about the environment. 50 years on from Stockholm, when the UN Environment Programme was created and the environment came into the picture for the first time. Let's reflect on that and see how we take that forward. Thanks, Ho.
Thank you all very much. Thanks to the excellent panelists for all of your remarks, and also to the participants for the questions. I think I'll just sum up in just 3 points that I think really puts the big picture, which is political will. I think there is political will, but there needs to be further strengthened. The message that we must all work together and work across different policy fields and silos. I think that was very clear. And that then the last one, which is that, you know, as was said repeatedly, there must be opportunities and incentives for all, and there must be a just transition when we deal with the green transition. And I thank you all for this great discussion. And I think I might see or be engaged with some of you at COP26, so wish you all the best for that conference. And I will turn the floor back to the organizers, because I'm not sure whether Jan or Alexa, you want to close the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry, thank you very much, Mr. Lim, for excellent moderation, and huge thanks to all the discussants and panelists. I'm now inviting Ms. Rupa Chandra, the Director of ESCAP's Trade, Investment and Innovation Division, to deliver the closing remarks.
Thank you very much. I think we've really had an informative and insightful discussion. I think just looking at the chat box and the kinds of questions and answers and the positive response that we've got, we can tell that this discussion has covered such a complexity of issues. And you know, hearing about the challenges of individual countries, as well as some of the positive initiatives that countries are taking at a national level, as well as some of the regional mechanisms and forums where this issue is being discussed, and also the possibilities at the multilateral level. I think we've got some very important messages that have come out of this panel discussion, which is, for instance, the unexploited potential in terms of trade facilitation and trade agreements at the regional or multilateral level to look at actions on climate change, or how to reform some of the domestic policies, or digitalization of trade and what could be done. So thank you very much for sparing your valuable time. A special thanks to the moderator for guiding this discussion so well. And we look forward to working with all of you to take this agenda forward. Thank you very much. And thank you to the participants once again for staying with us and contributing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye.